Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming. This video is a continuation of my Dark Ages Vampire Chronicle recap, where last we left our coterie. They were just due to depart from London to head to the Courts of Love, being France, as their mission was to instigate a war between the Courts of Love and the Fiefdoms of the Black Cross, being the Germanic states or Holy Roman Empire, Central European area. Now, the coterie had decided that the best way to do this was to write a play that would humiliate the brouhaha of the Italian city-states, allow that play to get into the hands of the Courts of Love, so the Courts of Love would publish it and propagate it as if it were their own, as it's the kind of thing Toreador tend to enjoy. The brouhaha taking such affront at the humiliation, at the downplaying, let's say, of some of their greater victories and admonishment of some of their more diabolic allegiances, would therefore attack the Courts of Love from the south via Languedoc. In so weakening the Courts of Love, the coterie would then be able to travel to the Fiefdoms of the Black Cross, where they'd be able to more easily persuade the Germanic Ventru to invade the Courts of Love alongside the Baronies of Avalon, led by Prince Mithras, which is the British Isles. If that sounds convoluted, I agree with you. This was not the chronicle I had planned when initially writing it, and so it was with great delight that the players came up with this particular plot. It was singularly inspired, perhaps even ingenious, that the best way to involve the brouhaha in this conflict would be to play upon their clan pride, their history, their lore, everything that the brouhaha are proud about, and completely tarnish it and run it through the muck. So that was the intention. The coterie therefore set sail by cog from London, intending on docking in Honfleur. From there they intended to head south to Chartres, where Cheyenne, one of our coterie, the Toreador among us, her sire was last known to be, sire by the name of Raoul, a spymaster who operated from Iberia up into the Courts of Love, and was occasionally attached to reporting into the Baronies of Avalon. So they intended to find out from Raoul what the lay of the land was, and who best to approach to get this play into the right hands so that it could spread the fastest and do the damage that the coterie required. Now, unfortunately for the coterie, something ill beset them. Now, this was through a result of various die rolls and poor luck, I will be honest, that after boarding the cog, they didn't happen to notice, at least until after the cog started sinking, when they were halfway through the English Channel, that emblazoned in various discreet places across the cog were various geometric shapes that could have in fact been attributed to Clan Tremere. Now, this cog and its captain were members of the Mithraic Mysteries, the cult of Mithras. They weren't ghouls, they weren't vampires, but the captain was a mortal who was a blooded soldier and had at some point accepted Mithras as his god. So he was used to transporting various of Mithras's demigod-like servants, vampires, from the British Isles to the Fiefdoms of the Black Cross or the Courts of Love or wherever else they needed to go. So the crew themselves were quite reliable, the coterie thought. Also, another vampire was on board, a Nosferatu by the name of Stroman, Stroman, from the Fiefdoms of the Black Cross, that the coterie quite kindly and inquisitively introduced themselves to in order to acquire some information. They wanted to find out what the state of the politics were in the Fiefdoms of the Black Cross at this time, what he was doing coming back from the British Isles, and whether he could be made an ally. Stroman, just to describe how he looks, is a mostly cloaked figure whose face, the bony apertures and fissures and upon his face have completely calcified over. His face resembles nothing so much as a big bone shield for the most part, with a great carved out maw where his mouth should be and bloodshot eyes behind it. Essentially all the bones in his skull have massively ossified at an extravagant rate. Almost like the condition the Elephant Man was known to suffer from, except largely affecting the front of his face rather than the back of his head or anything like that. So he was quite a sight to behold. Strongman introduced himself as a mercenary, a bit of a petty warlord from the Fiefdoms of the Black Cross. He was based out of Central Europe, and whilst he acknowledged and respected the rule of Hardstadt and Jürgen Swordbearer, he was very much his own man. He had been in the British Isles in order to recruit mercenaries and refused to confirm how successful he had been in that particular venture. He didn't want anything to do with the coterie's plans in the course of love, and in fact didn't really inquire as to them. He had purchased the right of travel by owing a debt to Mithras, and so he was on board the cog with them. Now, as I said, on about the second night of travel, so they were about 20 miles south of Dover, maybe, southwest of Dover, the ship started to take on terrible weather, all out of nowhere. It just hit the ship all of a sudden. Now, the captain's first inclination, despite the fact that the captain of a ship tends to look for his crew first of all, and passengers, was the safeguarding of the servants of Mithras. He therefore commanded them all to get below deck, because this storm was sudden, it was unexpected, and in fact it was more fearsome than anyone truly imagined it could be, as after the coterie had all gone below deck and many of the crew had joined them, and in fact many of the crew were growing especially leery of the vampires on board, due to maybe not trusting them, thinking they had accursed the ship. The main mast came down, crushed the captain's legs. The coterie did save him, and through some quick thinking, they salvaged 2 rowboats just as the cog was beginning to turn over. In doing so, they were able to save themselves, their herd, the captain and his boatswain, but unfortunately the rest of the crew were left clinging to barrels and wreckage in the rather windswept seas. And as the rowboats made their way away, all that could be heard really were the screams and cries and pleas for help that the vampires decided not to give. It was around this time that the coterie did happen to notice on the main mast one of these symbols etched into the wood that confirmed, at least to Ulrich's mind, that the Tremere had some involvement in this freak storm, and that means there's someone on the inside who is leaking information to the Tremere about their transit. Now, the coterie had a choice. They were probably closer to the English coast than they were to the French coast, but they decided they would press on, despite knowing that doing so the captain would likely die of his wounds. They needed the captain and the boatswain because none of the herds, or indeed none of the vampires, had any idea on how to navigate or row, to be quite frank. The captain did die within a night, and the vampires, cautious and slightly unsure of how they were going to survive the day, given that there was nothing to cover them with, there were no barrels beyond the barrel that was being tugged behind them with Sylvanus in, who is still essentially, for the sake of story, torpid at this point. They decided, after a moment of inspiration from Cheyenne, that they would use some rope to essentially keel-haul themselves. By that I mean they attach themselves by rope, essentially to the prow, or the hull rather, the hull of the boat, and drag themselves as far beneath the surface of the waves, the surface of the sea, as possible, so that sunlight wouldn't reach them. They would essentially be acting like dead bodies in the place of anchors. And hopefully, and being weighed down as they had been, they wouldn't just bob up to the top so they could get blasted by the sun's rays. Now, I'm not sure of the science of this, but I quite like the idea of it, so we went ahead with it. Resulting in the boats, when they finally did arrive in France, not at Honfleur, I will hasten to add, the vampires had not been scorched by the sun. It was around this time, of course, the herds became aware that their masters were in fact vampires. Ulrich's mercenaries had always been aware, because being a Ventru with a feeding preference, he can only feed from murderers or those who have killed others. he has recruited the Blooded, a mercenary band who are known for their terrifying skill in battle. He's recruited them all individually, the leader of which is Sven, his solitary ghoul. They already knew he was a vampire, and so they were prepared to carry this bizarre ritual out, dragging him beneath the sea during the day. Coraline's herd, our La Sombra, did not know that she was a vampire. They saw her as their mistress, and certainly through various beguiling tricks she was able to acquire their blood at times, but at no point had they become aware of the fact that she was a vampire. When she commanded them to drag her beneath the sea and then pull her up again when night came, it set something off in their mind, and so by the time they arrived in France, many of her herd were frightened or terrified that they were in the company of a devil, and were making way to peel off as soon as possible. Coraline, as a point of interest, is the only member of our coterie who is on the road of humanity. We have Coraline on the road of humanity, we have Ulrich on the road of kings, and we have Cheyenne on the road of sin, lastly the path of the devil. Heil is also on the road of kings, although the player has decided to take a break from the group for a little while, and he is therefore, his character has gone straight over to the Fiefdoms of the Black Cross to lay the political groundwork. The player of Sylvanus is still with the group. He's kind of taking an observer role for the time being, so his character is still there, and if he ever wants to get involved again, he can immediately. Quite seems to enjoy playing the audience or the Greek chorus when needed, and occasionally screeching NPCs. Anyway, so they all arrived in France in an unnamed fishing village, at least they didn't know the name of it. And so Ulrich sent Sven, his ghoul, ahead to clear the way, find a place that they could sleep during the day. Sven headed off, a rather dour Dane, a rather stolid and possibly even sociopathic type of a man. He returned around half an hour later, wiping his blade off on his thigh. He said, "It is done. We have a place to stay, my lord Ulrich." This actually set the vampires looking to one another. They, for whatever reason, the players having a bit of a soft moment, I suppose, weren't expecting one of their ghouls to just go out and murder somebody. They weren't expecting the ghouls to just commit violence for the sake of their master's safety, but the truth is that a ghoul, being a blood-addicted monster of its own right, is likely lacking some of the moral ambiguity that most humans suffer. And so after getting over the shock that Sven had probably just murdered the inhabitants of a house, they all trundled up to that house with its shuttered windows and found a single-storey abode, all daubed and the like, where the fisherman who lived within was dead. He was laid out within the bedroom. He'd just been stabbed within, and Sven explained, "Wife and daughter have been locked in pantry for your consumption." And he just walked off to accompany the rest of the mortal retinue. So, the vampires all sort of bedded down in the blood-streaked bedroom where Cheyenne, who was very hungry by this point and suffering no real humility when it comes to this sort of thing, started lapping up the quickly drying gore that was splattering the room. Coraline and Ulrich were well above that kind of behaviour, although they did contemplate feeding from the wife and daughter. Coraline dominated the wife and daughter into forgetting that they had ever been here, or that was at least the plan. Now, for those of you who this applies to, trigger warning up ahead. It will be covered within the next minute if you wish to skip ahead. During the following night, they all awoke, they started packing their bags to leave, and Ulrich asked Sven, "Have you dealt with the wife and child? Are we sure they aren't going to say anything?" And Sven said, the men and I enjoyed the wife and child during the day. They were doing nothing else, so we took the time to enjoy them, and we have buried them out in the woods. And again, the players were slightly shocked by this turn of events. They hadn't anticipated, again, their ghouls or mortal servants being monsters, rapists, and the like, but it being Middle Ages and these men being hardened and perhaps psychotic warriors of their own bent, I found it perfectly within keeping of the setting that they would behave like that. Ulrich admonished Sven for that behaviour, and they headed on south, where they found the nearest town to them was Rouen, Rouen, in northern France, which wasn't too far away from their destination, although they needed to head a more southwesterly direction in order to reach Chartres. They were closer to Paris than they would like, knowing that Prince Alexander within, a known paranoid who Cheyenne has acted against before in her prelude way back when we started this chronicle. She had actually managed to somehow infect Prince Alexander with syphilis, not personally, but through providing him with a syphilitic vessel that became his favoured vessel until somehow, via conspiring with Cappadocians or Salubri or something like that, the contagion managed to reach the vampire and has basically got through to his mind and helped detach it even further than it already was. So they want to avoid Paris at this point. That was actually her first mission as a spy before the entire chronicle started. And so as they arrived in Rouen, a massively faithful town with a cathedral under construction, churches abound, and many people, to be honest, farmers, traders, and priests, monks, and the like, they were telepathically contacted almost as soon as they entered the town. They bought themselves new clothes. They bought clothes from the market early evening, so Cheyenne looked in finery. Now, as soon as she received a telepathic message to come to the Black Bear, where she would meet up with the other Cainites of this town. To be continued.